I will present speakers that will speak maybe more in details and more, about their actual models that they developed. But that's, I hope you enjoyed, and if you have questions, you don't. Okay, great. So I want to present the next speaker, which is Ilan Kahan. Can I present him? Yeah, sure. Ilan is a data scientist here in Eleos. He became more sophisticated as I saw as time goes by, and now develops a lot of the solutions we have here. Comes from a background of data analysis before, and that's it. Go ahead, thank you. Yeah.
Speak closer to the mic so they hear you better on Zoom. No.
Okay.
To this mic.
Yeah, that's the okay. Do you guys hear me from the microphone? Maybe it's better for the microphone for Zoom also.
We hear you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm Ilan. I'm gonna talk about interventions and the process of building a model for classifying. Let me know if it's good. The process of building a model to classify interventions in a therapy session. So yeah, my name is Ilan. I'm a data scientist here in Eleos. This is my cool avatar, Trubit. And I come from a slightly different background. Okay. Okay, this is me. I come from a slightly different background. I was everybody's favorite profession. I used to be a consultant, but then I saw the light, moved to Israel, and became a data scientist. And yeah, there you go. I'm gonna talk about what are interventions. Amit touched on it briefly, but I'm gonna go a bit more deep, not too much. Then I'm gonna go into some challenges that of training a model for interventions and using our data, and how it looks in the end for the user. Also, Amit touched upon it, but I'm gonna highlight interventions there. Okay, so as Amit said, these are the main components of a therapy session, right? Interventions is right there. But what exactly are interventions? They are actions that facilitate the improvement of the patient's psychological, social, or emotional well-being. And what are the actions that a therapist can do during a therapy session? It's mostly speech. So here in our context, interventions means more specifically ways of phrasing and ways of speaking that will help and it will guide the patient towards improvement. I also want to touch on what interventions mean in EBT. So EBT is evidence-based therapy. And I want to talk about it because we serve clients in the US. And in the US, EBT is the most, or is a very popular modality of therapy. So we focus on that a lot. Okay, in EBT, interventions are tested and structured techniques that help the patient, help the therapist improve the patient's well-being. So that's the main difference, is the testing and structure between like just interventions in a whole and interventions in EBT. I want to give you guys a few examples to make things more clear. So first of all, positive reinforcement. Positive reinforcement encourages behavior change in the patient. For example, if the patient comes to the therapist and says, I started going to the gym recently twice a week, then the therapist can respond by saying, that's great, that's amazing, you should keep it up, it's going to be great for your long-term health. That's positive reinforcement. While cognitive restructuring is used to help people identify and change negative and unhealthy thinking patterns. also give you an example to make things more clear. If I am the patient and I tell my therapist that Amit sent me a message last night and he still didn't respond to me, therefore he hates me, then the therapist can answer by saying, what is your evidence for taking that conclusion? Like maybe you're taking it too far, maybe he didn't have time, you're seeing things black and white, he loves me, he hates me, and maybe things are that simple. And that will help you think about the situation in a different manner. Okay. Now, interventions are a very important part of the treatment. So the therapists need to include them in the notes. This is the depth note that Amit showed earlier, and I highlighted here where the interventions are. We have here the therapist validated their feelings and use cognitive restructuring to etc. So here we are talking about two interventions, validation and cognitive restructuring. So if the therapists need to put it in their notes and to evidence that they did interventions during the sessions, we want to help them with that. For that, we want to identify interventions that were used during the session. The problem is interventions is very domain specific, and our data is also very specific. As Amit said, it's not only specific, it's very unique. You won't find a database like that online. So unfortunately, exactly.
That's your reaction.
Yeah, that's part of the presentation. So unfortunately, we can't go into Hugging Face and find an interventions identifier for transcripts of therapy sessions. So we need to do our own. And I'm gonna go over the model training process and highlight some of the challenges that are involved. Maybe some of them are specific for interventions, some of them are like for all of our models. So starting with data preparation, as Amit said, we have transcriptions of therapy sessions. So the transcriptions themselves might be wrong. And also the speaker identified, sorry? Diarization. Yeah, diarization, that's also a problem. I didn't put it there because it's a fancy word, but yeah, diarization might be wrong. The separation and recognition of speakers might be wrong. So that means maybe the therapist said something that's considered an intervention, but that is identified as the client. So we can't use it in the end because it's like client speech. So that adds complexity to identifying interventions in a session. But who says what is an intervention or not? That's our amazing clinical analysts. Some of them are here. They are psychologists that work with us and they tag our data. So they go through the transcriptions and say here, the therapist use validation, here it use positive reinforcement and so on. And the thing is, two experts in the field can disagree on whether or not an intervention was used in a certain moment. So that adds yet another layer of complexity, not only for preparation, but also for the validation of the model later on. And finally, it's not a unique problem, but sometimes we have very little data to train our models. Okay, that's not the preparation. I'm going to go through a little bit of the data we use to train this specific model. So our analysts went through over 500 sessions, tagging interventions, and around 80,000, let's say, sentences were not interventions, and 5,000 were interventions. So it's a highly unbalanced data set. Some of the most represented interventions in that the most samples are validation. We have positive reinforcement and cognitive restructuring that I mentioned before, which is great. This is enough data to train a classifier, but that's not always the case. So Here we see the least represented interventions. We have emotion wheel with 1 sample and progressive muscle relaxation with 4. And I'll give a spoiler, they didn't go to production. Another interesting thing we can look on is the timestamps of the usage of the interventions. So we have here positive reinforcement and the timestamp of the session here, and there's kind of a hump in the beginning of the session. And here we have coping skills. If you squint, maybe it's like a normal distribution. And my not professional interpretation of that is that maybe in the beginning of the session, the patient talks about the nice things that happened to them in the last few weeks or days. And as the session goes on, starts talking about things that the patient needs coping with. So the therapist will apply some coping skills interventions. But that's just my opinion. Okay. Now going through to the data science research itself. I also forgot the time marking. Yeah. Okay. So some of the things that we needed to take into consideration for this specific model. Do we classify sentences? Because like basically we're tagging sentences, right? But the dialogue, the context is important. So do we classify whole sections of dialogue or do we classify only sentences? And if we classify a dialogue, how much of the dialogue do we give as input? Like should like therapist, patient, or just therapist, patient? Do we even take the patient into consideration into this classification because it's the therapist's speech that we want to classify? Do we train with a subset of interventions because we have so much difference in how much we have of each intervention? And do we even take the timestamps into consideration? Maybe what I said about problem positive reinforcement and coping skills makes no sense and it's just gonna mess things up. So maybe this is what you're expecting right now. I just gave the data to ChatGPT and call it a day. But you know, sometimes we need to get our hands dirty and actually do this. No.
Tipo, de cima tá normal e de baixo comentado vai. Aí eu troco.
That's my brother.
Comentado, vai.
Joe, desliga o microfone, por favor. And okay, this is a few things that I tried for this specific model. The ones, so we're talking about, a lot of them are structured, right? I talked about GPT, that a lot of them are structured. So maybe TF-IDF will give us good results. So I tried TF-IDF with a grid search of different classifiers and parameters. Also a pipeline of encoding the sentences with sentence encoder, doing dimensionality reduction or not, and then classifiers, and training BART classification. As Amit said, smaller models sometimes give us good results. So we tried the BART classifier, and then we can adjust the threshold per label to give us the intended precision and recall that we want. And some techniques. Yeah. So we have unbalanced data sets, so maybe downsampling the not interventions is a good idea. We can train only for a few interventions and not the, we have 20 labels here. So maybe we can try like 5 and then 5, or the ones with the most data. Another thing I tried was to manually alter the weights in the loss function to give more weight to the less represented interventions, for example. And a binary classifier of, is this an intervention or is this not an intervention? And very well. The ones in green are the ones that are like somewhat in production in some capacity, and the ones in red weren't good enough. but I tried. This is a nice graph that I like. You can see here the precision and the recall, and the area is like total predictions and correct predictions. And on the x-axis, we have the threshold. And it's just showing like here we can define like what are we prioritizing, precision or recall. And we can define a threshold in the bar classifier that's give us the result we want. And then that's more of a product thing, I guess. But we also need to take into consideration, of course. Finally, for moving to production, I couldn't think of anything super unique, but we have data security because our models have a lot of PHI, personal data, but it's not exclusive to us. I guess everyone here has to do with data security. And finally, this is what matters, right? How it looks, the UI, how the user sees it and uses it. So this is what Amit was showing back in his presentation. When the therapist is writing his data part of the notes, we will have the interventions here on the side, and then he can decide whether he uses or not, our suggestion. That not only helps with documentation, but also as like a guide of what the therapist did during the session. Maybe he forgot he did something and we'll have it here. Maybe he didn't know, maybe he just wants confirmation of of if he's applying the intervention or not. And we can also check this timeline here of the session with some techniques that he used during the session. And to finalize, I picked randomly some feedback from our users. So coincidentally, they're all 5 out of 5. And they all say how great the interventions are. Yeah, that's it. And, any questions?
When working with other models such as BART, how do you handle you have only a small window?
Context?
Yes.
Yes. I think for this one, I use like just one like context window, say before and after, and it had results, like good enough results. That's.
Is there a tendency between the labels? For example,
Yeah.
one passage.
I checked the confusion matrix and I thought of putting it here, but I found one instance of like, we had 2 labels, identifying cognitive distortions and cognitive restructuring, which by the name kind of seem related, and they were very related. In the end, we combined them into one class. So sometimes.
I mean, if it's during time and the temporal aspect, if the first passage say one impression, does it modify the probability impression and then following passage?
That's interesting. I don't know.
Are you looking long term at the effects of interventions on the outcomes?
Yes, I looked at it once, but in that analysis, we didn't find much, but I can't say for sure.
But we did find maybe correlation of interventions with specific behaviors, other behaviors in the session, but not specifically on outcome. Wasn't so good.
What do you do with the privacy of the information? I mean, the patients, do they know that it goes anywhere and it's been used for analysis?
Yeah, so that's more of a contract fee, but we have, let's say we have 2 main products, Scribe and Replay. The Replay is the one that you can replay the session. So we need consent from both the therapist and the patients. But then Scribe, after we finish analyzing the session, it deletes the data. So there's no storage of the session. Something like that.
You need to recognize the emotions in the session.
Sorry, can you repeat?
The emotions during the session, something that's important.
We don't, I don't think we have any models to detect emotions right now. So, but if it's important or not, I can.
Thank you, Ilan. Now I will present the next speaker, a team lead here in Eleos in the data team. We have actually a really large data team, so when I say team lead, like I really mean it. Each even sub-team is huge. Comes from the background of data science in many medical fields. Thank you. Yeah, for the next presentation. So I'm going to talk today about how we empower psychological research areas.
תדליק לי את האור.
שיש לך אוטו.
Okay. So as I mentioned, my name is Ido, I'm a data scientist, team lead. I have a background in NLP, audio processing, time series analysis. Mainly worked in a medical startup. The background of biomedical engineering. That's interesting. I'm at Eleos for 2 years already. And so today I'm going to talk with you about clinical research at Eleos, high level. And then I'm going to dive a little bit deeper with single paper that we did here about climate anxiety. So we talk about what is climate anxiety, why it's interesting for us, about the data, the solution that we did the data science part, of course the results and such. Okay, so let's start with the clinical research at Eleos. The research is being led by Dr. Shiri Sadeh-Sharvit, which is our chief clinical officer. We have a lot of research type. Roughly speaking, we have around 4 types of research or papers. First one is randomized clinical trials, RCTs, which I guess everyone are familiar with. Basically, we saw that while, I don't know if it's surprising or not, but if you let the therapist focus on the therapy and reduce the burden of documentation and all the rest, the clinical outcomes are also better. Okay? So we actually see it and it's really nice. The second thing is the impact of therapy techniques on clinical outcomes. There was a question here before regarding this. There is a paper that we showed that when clinicians use a specific technique that they should do at the end of each session, there were better outcomes for the clients. Okay, so this is something that we actually saw significantly. It was significant. And third one is AI integration in therapy practice. So this is basically what we do best here at Eleos, how to integrate AI in therapy, and we also publish papers on this. And the last one is the one that I'm also going to talk about is real life session analysis, therapy analysis. So we have a lot of data, we want to understand, and it's a unique data. And we can analyze real life sessions over the US and get insights out of them. Okay, so we can ask questions about this data. So let's start with the paper. And first of all, let's discuss about climate anxiety. What is it? Why it's an interest for us? And first, let's start by definition. So climate anxiety is defined as the anxiety stemming from the global climate crisis and the looming threat of environmental disaster. Basically, what it means that I guess all of us in some way are a little bit anxious about climate, global warming and climate crisis, but some people have more anxiety compared to others. And this is where it comes to the therapy session. And there are many researchers that found linkage between climate crisis and mental health consequences. It's something that we see in many papers, and notable organization in the field of psychology has established task forces aimed to raise the awareness of climate anxiety
and educate the professional about it. So there is a lot of hype, I would say, in recent years around this topic. A lot of conferences that discuss this one, but explicit discussion in psychotherapy remains largely unexplored. Okay, so no one really knows how common, yeah, thanks, is it. So we have a lack of empirical data, and most studies are qualitative by nature. It's like few sessions or few patients that discuss about it, and we wanted to close this gap. So how did we do it? With our data, obviously, we analyzed over 32,000 sessions, average around 55 minutes. These sessions resulted in 1.7 million micro-dialogues. Micro-dialogues is few ping-pongs between the therapist and the patient. Okay, so as Ilan showed earlier, this is what we define as micro-dialogues. This session were held over 12 US states in 4 US regions, around 850 different therapists and almost 8,000 different clients. The data was over 30 months. Okay, so what we do with this data? First of all, we took all of the transcription. Again, I remind you, these are very long transcription, around 55 minutes. We segmented them to micro dialogues, basically something that looks similar to this one. Then we did a simple word search with regex to identify or narrow down this list. Okay, so we had 1.7 million micro dialogues. We wanted to narrow down them. We identified around 500 words relative to weather or climate. We started with a smaller list, and we increased this list with word to vec. And something interesting that we saw during this research is actually we use a lot of climate-related words when we talk about our emotions, or when therapists want to convey a message to the patient. So there are three nice examples. I felt flooded with anger, or something that the therapist would say to the client. Each time a thought pops into your head, imagine placing it on one of these clouds and allowing it to float on by. My heart's racing like a thunderstorm, can say that. So there are a lot of these climate words. And obviously, the word search is not enough. So for this paper, we fine-tuned a classifier. This classifier was based on a BART model that was originally fine-tuned to summarize conversation. The idea is that the model already knows how to understand conversation. And what we did, we added a classification head on top of the BART model. I guess some of you are already well with this technique. We frozen the model parameters, the original one, and we trained only the classification head. This gives pretty good results. We actually managed to succeed to identify micro dialogues that relates to climate or weather or neither or both in a high precision. And finally, we did a temporal analysis over these micro dialogues. We analyzed the sessions over time and across US regions. We did actually more analysis. We also did topic detection for these micro dialogues. I will not go into details on how we did it here because I don't have time, but we also looked at clinical outcomes. We'll find some interesting stuff. I will talk about it later. Okay, so those are the key results, I would say. As you can see here, the percentage of micro dialogues over time and across US regions, okay, the dotted line here are different region, and the black line is an average of the entire US, is really, really sparse. And you can see that the percentage is around 0.5% of microdialogues, which is really low. And an interesting thing we saw here is that here, like 2021, you see this peak. So we went out and looked actually what happened at this time, and we found out that there was a big storm in the US, something really significant, and it was a really nice validation to our pipeline to see that it actually worked. And another thing that I didn't mention earlier, but one of our hypotheses was that over time, because this subject is, I would increasing in their rise, like it's talked more and more, so we would see higher percentage over time of microdialogues that discuss on this topic, which we actually didn't see. We didn't see any change, any significant change. And another interesting thing that we saw is that most of the microdialogues that did discuss weather or climate was actually about stuff that's related to self-care, interpersonal communication, therapy, stress, or leisure activities. So for example, I couldn't go to a walk last week because it was rainy. I missed the session, the therapy session, because I don't know, it was a bad weather. Or I went to vacation, it was sunny and amazing. So to conclude, we saw here that the explicit mention of climate change or global warming is pretty rare. We don't see it a lot. The climate discussions remain infrequent, often tied to self-care or leisure. Okay, so the topics are not fully related to anxiety. Clients with more depressive or anxiety symptoms discuss climate and weather less. This is also a thing that we saw. When they talk more about weather, they're actually less anxious or depressed. And the last thing, or the nicest thing for me, I would say, is that we actually can use data and NLP here at Eleos to offer valuable support to advance the psychological field. So we actually use the data that we have, the tools that we have here, the data science tools, to advance the field and empower the field. That's it. Thank you.
I wonder if you got the chance to look at like data that's like more years back or even like a lot more years back, like maybe it's not like the percentages are very low, maybe they're like higher than they were 20 years ago when climate change was not that much in awareness.
It's a good question. First, yeah, the question is if we looked at data that was even more years backwards, and the claim was that maybe the percentage is low, but it's higher compared to data for, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago. So we don't have data before, I don't remember when it started.
30 months.
Yeah, 30 months.
2000.
But I think 30 months, which is a lot of time, we would expect to see any increase over this time period. It's not like 2 or 3 months data. And this was part of our, we expected to see increase. We did.
What do you think the political organization actually has explicitly? I mean, saying, how do you feel about the general state of the world now? You worry that there are future people might be thinking about climate change, but they won't say climate change. But yes, I am worried about the way things are going. That things are going to be worse with the level of my parents and so on, which, you know, you don't mention the word because the world's going to be hot and everybody will go nuts because of that.
Yeah, so this is a great comment. Actually, it's in our discussion. Yeah, so what's her name? Dan commented that perhaps patients doesn't speak about it in the therapy, but they are affected from it, right? This is your...
Yeah, I think it's not explicitly asked on the protocol.
Yeah. So I would say 2 things about it. First of all, documentation. We also analyze documentation, and again, we had only 15 minutes for lecture, but we also analyze documentation, and we didn't see almost any mention to this topic. This is another very interesting point. But what you said is really something that we discussed about in the paper. We assume that there are topics in the past that in the history of psychology where a topic wasn't discussed. Right? I think racism and similar topics I actually don't remember now. Maybe some of the clinical analysts remember. But it wasn't discussed in there. It took time for the community to understand it's an issue and it needs to be discussed. Right? So this is one of our assumptions that maybe this is the reason that we don't see it in like real life.
Your assumption, because you talk about climate anxiety, but you looked at climate mentioning. You're not necessarily, so your understanding of climate anxiety was according to the topics. And if you saw in topic stress, you said, okay, this topic is climate anxiety. Because what you check is the mentioning of climate, not exactly.
So first of all, yes, the topic, we expected to see topics that more relate less to leisure, more to stress, anxiety, stuff like this. And this file is just an example, but when we look at the entire list, it's something that we see repeat itself. And second of all, our assumption was that if this is an issue for you, we will talk about it a lot. So we would mention this. This was the basic assumption here.
We need to.
Okay, so we need to stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is amazing data, brilliant work. We're gonna have time to ask more questions for the speakers after our next talk. We're gonna have a few minutes break. So I'm happy